Today we're going to do the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. This is a painful book because of what Douglass goes through, but it is beautiful. It's the true story of Frederick Douglass, who was a slave, an American slave written by himself is the subtitle. And after he escaped from slavery and renamed himself Frederick Douglass and felt safe, then he wrote this autobiography and was a really famous abolitionist, gave a lot of speeches and things. He talks about his childhood and how he had always been in slavery. He's very open and honest. Near the beginning, here in chapter 1, is some of the most painful stuff when he talks about a woman who was whipped and whipped by her master. And it's that there are a couple passages like that, and they're hard to read. They're painful to read, but I think they're important to read. They're important to know. I think I've mentioned reading this along with some other American history books. I think it would be very valuable. And you could also do a little history of slavery in America with reading through some of I recommended some Tocqueville for you that had to do with it. Also, you could read some documents from around the founding time. Tucker is one that I'll do that you can review and read him. I'll see if I can find him online. And anyway, you could go through the whole history, do your Uncle Tom's Cabin, your Frederick Douglass, go through some Lincoln stuff, and then come into civil rights period and read some Martin Luther King. It's a very important subject. It's I heard of a state back east a few years ago. I can't remember which one it was, and honestly I haven't verified it, so I guess it is possible that it's not even true, but the idea of it feels true because this is where we've come to. There was a school district that had decided to start American history after the Civil War because they didn't want to deal with the slavery issue. It was controversial. There's a good chance it was somewhere in the South because there's still difficulties today in the South, and there's still prejudice that goes on and on both sides now. Anyway, so there's things like that are painful, but then Douglass tells his story, and of course I'm all about education, so when it's about education then I get super excited. But his life really began when he was given over to a couple, and the woman had never had slaves, the wife. And she saw them as human beings and treated them as human beings, and she started teaching Douglass to read. And life really began for him when he began to learn to read. The husband found out what was happening and stopped her, and he's like, man, don't you know that if these people ever learn to read, they'll rise up against us, and we can't let that happen. And so she doesn't finish teaching him, but he says, my new mistress proved to be all she appeared when I first met her at the door, a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She'd never had a slave under her control previously to myself, and prior to her marriage had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. She was made trade by a weaver, and by constant application to her business she'd been in a good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects from slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. And so she gave him some instruction, but her husband made her stop because he knew how dangerous it was to have slaves that could read. But after that, he had enough of a foundation that he could figure the rest out. And there's a new children's book that tells the story of how he taught himself to read and what a difference it made in his life. he would try to trick the little white boys around that knew how to read, and he would draw out letters and say, you know, I can't remember exactly how it went, but he would say, that's not how you draw this or that, right? And then they would prove him wrong by writing out the letter and saying it correctly. And so he was able to get all his sounds down and then start to put words together and taught himself to read. And the first book that made a huge impression on him, it was called, he says, I was about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about this time, I got hold of a book entitled The Columbian Orator, and every opportunity I got, I used to read this book. It was a dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times. The dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them when the slave was retaken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things to reply to his master, things which had the desired, though unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master. And so it wasn't just any book, it was a book about his life and his reality and his world and his existence and what it was that he was about. And 12 is a very impressionable age. He's beginning to feel like an adult, behave like an adult, think abstractly, and come into his own. And so this coming into his life as he was learning to read and then making all this difference, it changed everything for him. He says, the moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of even a slaveholder. What I got from Sheridan, the author, was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. But then he goes on to say how difficult this experience made his life. On the one hand, and it's kind of like this, I talked a little bit in a Maslow review about his chapter on the need to know and the fear of knowing. And that's kind of that's a theme in life. That's a difficulty we all face. And here's Douglas, and he wants to know. He wants to know the truth. He reads these arguments and internalizes them. But on the other hand, this truth and this information, this knowledge is very, very painful and oppressive to him. He says a little further down, as I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read. That's the husband of the woman that started teaching him to read. He said, as soon as he learns to read, he will become discontent with the situation and it will make him a very bad slave. Which he had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I often envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to mine own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. And that sets the stage for the rest of what happens to him as he begins to think of himself as a free man and the experiences, one in particular, that shows him who he really is and makes him determined to be a free man no matter what he had to do. And then eventually to be able to orchestrate freeing himself and coming out of slavery and becoming a free man. It's very short. It's 100, with the appendix, 125 pages. You can read it in a couple days. The language is easy. The spelling has been modernized to make it even easier to read. But it's a very important piece of American history from a man who was on the inside and saw both sides. He was ignorant and dumb for many years about really just ignorant of reading, which made him, he understood the situation. It felt wrong, like he knew there were human rights and he knew that what was happening to him was wrong. But then came the reading and the study and the thinking and the intellectual arguments, and that was absolutely torturous, but it was the catalyst that made him determined to free himself. So it's a wonderful one to read alongside some of the other books that I've mentioned. I really love it. I really feel like everybody should read it and discuss it in your groups, and because it's a first-hand witness of the kinds of things that can go on, that do go on, that have gone on, and if read and discussed correctly, it creates a more empathic heart. It helps us. It will help you, I hope, as it has helped me, to better understand other individuals who do not have the same privileges and opportunities I have. It's made me more grateful and more generous and understanding of the kinds of things people go through, and therefore I can't judge. So, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, it's in the public domain. You can find it online for free if you want to. Book form's nice because then you can do all your quote marking and question asking and everything. Anyway, I hope it will be a great blessing to you as it has been to me. See you next time.